I'm going to get a little bit Freudian just for a couple of minutes, okay? This is quite deep psychology that I'm going to give you, and I'm probably not going to do it justice in the next couple of minutes, but it gives you an overview of why the psyche fights against itself, okay? So, this is Freud. If you've never seen a picture of him before, Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud came up with three things in the human psyche, okay? One was called the ID, one was called the ego, and one was called the superego. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at these, because they fight between each other, which is what knocks our balance out. Some of you guys on this call will know the word Gestalt, lack of Gestalt. It's a German word, funnily enough. Sigmund Freud was German. It's a German word. It means lack of balance or lack of equilibrium. And our internal fighting between our ID, ego and superego, it knocks that out for us, and that's where our mental health starts to suffer at that point, okay? So let me give you a bit of Freud. Okay, if you want to know more about this, you just Google ID, ego and superego. You'll find out loads more about it, okay? So your ID is the pleasure center of the brain and seeks immediate gratification. That's what your ID does, okay? So just bear that in mind. Your ID, it seeks pleasure. It seeks gratification, okay? It seeks being happy, right? That's part of your psyche. Your ego is concerned with making rational decisions. Now, that goes against what you might know as an ego. Okay, we all know in the current culture, we talk about ego, somebody showing off, all that type of stuff, right? Actually, the original Freudian description of ego was your ego is concerned with making rational decisions. And then your superego, that makes moral judgments. Okay, so your ID wants pleasure, your ego is concerned with making rational decisions, and your superego makes moral judgments. Your ego is constantly pulled between your ID and your superego, okay? I know this is quite into psychology now, but follow me with it. Your ego is pulled constantly by your ID or by your superego. When your ego is pulled by your ID, we become overly worried and neurotic. So when there's a pull towards, so this is your moral judgment, remember, okay, pulling towards gratification, if we're pulling it over there, we actually become neurotic in the nth game, or overly worried about stuff, and of course that affects mental health. When your ego is being pulled by your superego, then we feel guilty and start to self-blame. So because of this battle that is constantly going on in your head, when we are centered, we have Gestalt, we have balance, but when we're being pulled by these other two parts of our psyche, we can either go into a self-blame cycle, beating ourselves up, or we can go into a cycle where we start to get overly worried and concerned about lots of things that potentially we don't need to be concerned about. So I don't really want to do any more on that, but and if you haven't quite followed it, that's okay. If you want to find out more information, just Google about this with Freud, and there's a whole book on it for argument's sake. The point I'm making, 3 elements to your psyche, and your central element is constantly trying to be pulled side to side, taking us into lack of balance, lack of Gestalt, and either making us very, very worried or self-blaming and beating up, which of course affects mental health. So that's the Freudian description of the main things that affect our psyche, as it were, and why we find ourselves struggling with mental health sometimes, okay? So I hope you found that interesting anyway. There's a bit of background there for you, okay?